So the last time we were talking about kind of the arrival of these Nahua-speaking peoples into the Valley of Mexico. Now, remember, the Nahua are a branch of a larger family called the Uto-Aztecan language, which is related to everything from the Shoshone, which are located in what is now Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, to Taromaran, which of course is in Chihuahua, all the way down to here in the Valley of Mexico. And so you essentially have this large expansion of peoples, and eventually you begin to, now remember, keep in mind that this isn't a sudden migration. We're talking about waves, and kind of like waves and waves, and like so kind of turning on and off a faucet. And eventually one of these groups that arrives here is the Mexica. The Mexica, again, are one of the Nahua speaking peoples, and actually kind of, quite frankly, one of the lesser known peoples. In other words, there was much stronger, much bigger tribes, and the Mexica was just kind of one of the smaller ones. And so they actually arrived late in the Valley of Mexico. All right, sometime around, let's say, 1250 CE. And for the first 75 years of their existence within the Valley of Mexico, the Mexica pretty much just wander around the lake. In other words, here, Lake Texcoco, you begin to see them kind of just migrate, and their main source of survival, their main kind of occupation, eventually becomes um, of mercenary work. In other words, they become soldiers for hire for the other Atapetos. Remember, the word Atapeto refers to the city states. And so the Atapetos hire the Mexica out in exchange for money. Now, again, to their credit, the Mexica become incredible warriors. Now, according to Mexica religion, the Mexica were apparently told by prophecy that they would not be allowed to settle and find a new homeland until a very specific symbol was shown to them. And the symbol, for those of you who are aware, is of course the brown eagle or the golden eagle devouring a serpent on top of a cactus in the middle of the lake, which is a very specific prophecy, but nonetheless, according to them, around 1325, they begin doing this. Now, uh, they find, or at least they begin settling on two very small islands on the lake, and using the same technique that they build the Chinampas. Remember, the Chinampas are basically just floating islands, artificial man-made islands. The Mexica used that same technique to basically build out the islands, and eventually found two cities, Texcoco and, no, I'm sorry, not Texcoco, Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco. All right, now again, this is not just FYI. You can see here at the top here, Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco are the two cities that they find. Now, eventually, Tenochtitlan will grow and basically kind of absorb Tlatelolco, but for now, you essentially have two distinct cities. Now, these cities were connected to the mainland through a series of causeways, or what are known as basically just bridges. Now, this is what the city looked like here in these the during this is actually the city right before the Spanish arrived in 1519. And as you can see here, it is connected through a series of causeways or bridges. This is their connection to the rest of the mainland of around the area of Lake Texcoco. Now, eventually, all right, now, well, let's just start off with this. Now, originally, the Mexica actually were paying tribute to a particular Atepetl, a particular city-state, that of Azcapotzalco. Now, just FYI, that's not really important. Here is Azcapotzalco. All right, here is the city that originally actually dominated the Mexica, but eventually the city of Tenochtitlan entered into alliance with two other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan. All right, and eventually these three cities formed an alliance to overthrow the Atapetl of Azcapotzalco. All right, so not only did they overthrow the city and conquer it, they began conquering the other nearby cities as well, eventually expanding their empire into this relatively large empire that we refer to as the Aztec Empire. Now, keep in mind, I want to make this very clear from this point on. The word Aztec it refers to the alliance between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. All right. Again, I want to make that very clear. All right. So the word Aztec refers to what we refer to in historical terms as the triple alliance between the city of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. All right. And we're referring to the people of the of Tenochtitlan. They are simply the Mexica. All right. So again, I just want to make that distinction moving forward. Uh, what exactly? How would it? What do you mean when the city itself, the islands? No, remember, the islands are built. You know, you basically dig up soil from the bottom of the lake, and yeah, so you dig up soil from the bottom of the lake, and you put them on platforms, almost like pallets. And after a while, you plant stuff on them, and that you know the roots of these plants will eventually go to the bottom of the lake, and you basically have floating artificial islands. Well, floating is a misconception. They're actually just kind of just they're man-made islands. Yeah, so it's pretty much you just dig soil from under the ground, you place them on top of a pallet, and eventually over a long period of time, that pallet becomes an island. So as they expand their empire, you eventually have the Mexica allowing, or the Aztecs in general, allowing local rulers to retain their lands and titles in exchange for tribute. Now, so again, you have here a very decentralized empire where the Aztecs have absolutely no interest um, in governance. Well, I wouldn't say no interest. They pretty much allow the local rulers to pretty much manage their own affairs on the condition that they pay a tribute, all right, in the form of textiles, jewelry, and clothes, skins, food, and especially slaves. Slaves will become an incredibly important part of the Mexica demands for tribute, which I'll explain in just a bit. And so again, as long as the subject peoples pay their taxes, they would they would pretty much allow them to control themselves. Special tax collectors would travel throughout the empire to collect this tribute from the subject Atapetels. These officials were usually only representatives of the Triple Alliance. Now, the communities in the frontiers of the empire rarely paid any tribute at all. So again, this was a very, very in the greater scheme of things, this is a very disorganized empire because again, the bureaucracy, the little bureaucracy that the Mexica had was only interested in collecting tribute. All right, and even then, the tribute was not collected evenly. Those Atapetos, those other regions in the far frontiers of the empire, all right, rarely had visits from these tax collectors, all right, simply because they're just too far away. Now, um, the Mexica ruled by a combination of diplomacy and war. Before a city was attacked, the Mexica would send diplomats to negotiate a surrender. Most of the time, these negotiations would work. The Atapetos realized that trying to face the Mexica Empire, or at least the Aztec Empire, head on was simply just not a good idea, and so many of them just simply surrendered. Even when the Atapetel chose war, the Aztecs only fought until the enemy surrendered. Now, again, I will make this a very clear distinction because in many cases, especially that in Europe, the Europeans will fight until basically the enemy is obliterated. The Mexica only fight until the enemy formally surrenders, and hostilities end right after that. Now, so again, as I mentioned before, at the heart of the Mexica Empire is the city of Tenochtitlan. Now, by 1521, the two islands that had originally made the capital, remember you have Tenochtitlan and then you have Tlatelolco, had merged into one massive city with as estimated at most 500,000 people living in these two islands. Now, the city was divided into four main zones. These zones are known as campans. All right, these think of them like the districts. So the city itself was divided into four different districts or campans. All right, and again, this is a way to essentially manage and control the city itself. You have three main avenues here, kind of controlling traffic throughout the city. Now, at the heart of the city is the Gran Templo. The Gran Templo is located here. Now, this is if for those of you who are familiar with Mexico City, this area here is located in what is now considered to be the Zócalo here in the heart of Mexico City. Now here at the heart of the Zócalo is the Gran Templo. Now if you notice here, there are two ceremonial huts here at the top of the summit. All right, now one is for the deity Tlaloc, and the other one is for the Mexica's main deity, that of Huitzilopochtli. Huitzilopochtli is the most important deity and the one that is most revered in Mexico, because Huitzilopochtli here is the god of war. All right. So Huitzilopochtli, again, and Tlaloc, which is the mother goddess, become essentially the two most revered deities in this particular city and this particular society. Now, and again, you have various deities, you have various, other, obviously this is a polytheistic society. So you have do have some worship of Quetzalcoatl. Remember, Quetzalcoatl, his position, this god's position within the greater pantheon of Mexica deities is over exaggerated. Remember, I was telling you that many early historians writing in the 1800s would claim that the Mexica didn't really put up a fight against the Spaniards because they thought that Hernan Cortés was Quetzalcoatl. That is not true. All right, but again, just keep in mind, but by this period in time, Quetzalcoatl really wasn't. Yeah, people kind of knew who he was, but the only ones who really revered him were a small section of priests. Right. So for the most part, again, the Quetzalcoatl, who at one point in time was an important deity in Central America, was again, not as important as in Mexico. Now you have other deities, for example, like Tezcatlipoca, again, who is kind of considered to be the god of time and Lord of the North. And so you have, again, this is just various examples. Now, something that is probably most familiar to all of you is the concept of human sacrifice. As I mentioned in the past, the Mexica, and along with many other central Mexican societies, practice a form of human sacrifice. Again, the infamous tearing out the heart of individuals, and indeed it is a very important part of this. The Mexica believed that the gods depended on human blood as a form of survival, and when they did not receive sufficient sacrifice, bad things would happen. Crops would fail, earthquakes would happen, just bad stuff in general. Now, just to give you an idea of just how important human sacrifice was to the Mexica, when the Gran Templo opened in what we believe is the year 1487, all right, it was celebrated over a period of 3 days by sacrificing 10,000 people. Now, so, a lot of people kind of wonder about the willingness of its victims. Do people want to be sacrificed? Yeah, no. I mean, I guess it kind of depends. Obviously, needs to say many Mesoamericans at this time were taught that being sacrificed to the gods was his great honor, but at the same time, yeah, many who simply just were sacrificed because they were forced into it. All right, and so I mean, obviously, say this is an incredibly brutal method of execution. Having your heart ripped out from under your rib cage is not exactly a painless way to die, but nevertheless, it is an important aspect of Mexica society. Any questions? Now, one last thing I will mention is that when the Spanish arrived in the New World, they begin to overly exaggerate, or they begin telling a lot of stories about various Indian tribes, both within Mexico and without Mexico, practicing both human sacrifice and cannibalism. The thing about it, so the Mexica, we do know that absolutely they practice human sacrifice, but you begin to see them claim this on other societies outside of Mexico, which there is no corroborating evidence that they did this. Now, there is a very simple explanation for this, is that legally speaking, the Spaniards were bound by laws. And one of these laws was the issue of what we call a just war. Now, what this means is the Spanish simply just couldn't go into an area, conquer the people, and subjugate them into slavery. They technically needed, they legally needed a reason to actually do this. And so many Spanish conquistadores, upon arriving into a new area and wanting to conquer these regions, would eventually claim things like, oh, well, these people, we had to pacify them. And I use this word because this is what they use a lot, which basically means conquer. We had to conquer, aka pacify these people because they were eating each other or they were practicing human sacrifice. All right, so many of the claims that the Spanish created was simply just a way to justify their own conquest. Now, it's not to say that, yes, there were Native American tribes and entities, polities that did practice human sacrifice and cannibalization, but again, we always have to kind of take Spanish claims with a grain of salt, because at the end of the day, what they're most interested in is, again, the issue of conquest, the issue of trying to kind of subjugate the peoples and using any means necessary to do that. Now, one of the issues that your textbook has that that I want to correct right away is that according to your textbook, uh, the word Inca refers to the word children of the sun. It does not. The word Inca actually means ruler in the language of Quechua. Quechua, for those of you who don't know how to spell it, Quechua is the dominant language here in the Andes region at this point in time. All right, so we're talking right before the arrival of the Europeans. And so the word Inca does not mean children of the sun. It actually means simply just ruler. As a matter of fact, the Incan emperor is known as the Inca Sapa, which means basically the king of kings. Now, in reality, the Inca did not refer to themselves as Incan or their empire as the Incan Empire. They actually called it Tawanatitsuyu. Right, as you can see here, this was the actual name they used it, but we call them Inca because no one outside of the Quechua-speaking world wants to say Tawanatitsuyu. Right, so archaeologists believe that the Quechua-speaking Inca peoples moved into Cusco Valley around 1200 CE. So again, much like the Mexica in Mexico, the Incas are not original inhabitants of this region. We don't really know their origins. We believe they actually came from higher in the Andes mountain region and eventually moved into the Cusco Valley here. They began quickly taking control of other local groups here, known as the Ayllu, and eventually forming a small kingdom. Now, each kinship group, each Ayllu, eventually worshipped a particular sacred space. Now, this is incredibly important. All right. Now, the idea of sacred spaces or sacred places themselves is pretty commonplace. I mean, for example, take a look at, if you remember, we were talking about medieval Europe, and you have the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which, according to Christians, is the place where Jesus was originally born. Now, you have other sacred spaces as well, and so these sacred spaces in the Andes region, known as Huaca, right, are again considered to be sacred spaces. And again, these could take the form of anything. It could take the form of a rock formation. It could take the form of a waterfall, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in Andean society, you often have either sacrifice or even sacrifice of young children in these sacred spaces. Now, the members of the ruling class and nobility distinguish themselves by wearing large earrings. So again, you have here a clear class distinction, especially among the nobility, which often identify themselves by the size of their earrings. The larger the earring, the wealthier and more prominent the individual was. As a matter of fact, when the Spanish arrived, you begin to note them, or they begin recording them as orejones. For those of you who don't speak Spanish, the word orejon just basically means big ears. And so again, the larger the ears, the larger the jewelry of the ears by an individual, the more prominent they are. Now, the Sapa Inca, which again is the emperor, if you will, was considered to be semi-divine, and therefore was considered to be above worldly issues. So the Inca Sapa, or the Sapa Inca, forgive me, was more than anything else just a ceremonial figurehead. In other words, the idea is, because this individual is basically a walking god, local things like administrating an empire and adjusting tax rates, they can't be bothered by that, because they're gods. So most of the administration, the day-to-day administration of the Incan kingdom, later on empire, mostly resides or mostly falls in the hand of a close relative. Now, one of the interesting things about the Sapa Incas is that you have a long tradition of sibling marriages, all right, where you essentially have oftentimes the Sapa Inca marrying a sister and continuing the line there. Needless to say, as far as we could tell, especially from the remains that we have discovered of the previous Inca Sapas, or the Sapa Incas, forgive me, you essentially have obviously severe genetic issues as well. Now, remember, keep in mind, from the point, the northern point of Incan authority, which is now located here in what is now modern day Colombia, all the way down to the the most southern tip, which is again kind of in the middle of Chile. This is 3,000 miles long. Needless to say, this is a massive empire. And again, the expansion of the kingdom of Cusco truly began with the rule of Viracocha. Viracocha is considered to be kind of the great conqueror, and eventually kind of launches armies into the Andes region, and you have them conquering more and more territory. And the successors continue to expand the empire. But again, by the time the Spanish arrived, this empire has, again, 3,000 miles long and nearly 10 million people. Now, the Inca state itself was a lot more hierarchical and centralized than the Aztecs. Remember, keep in mind, the Aztecs had a very decentralized bureaucracy. In other words, pretty much local rulers were told just to keep things as stable as possible. The Inca took a lot more hands-on approach to administering their empire than the Mexica did. They divided their empire into 4 administrative sectors, which were then divided into provinces, with each under a governor from the Cusco elite. And so again, you have 4 administrative sectors divided into provinces, and each of these provinces was ruled by a ruling member of the imperial family. Now, local rulers were allowed to keep their titles of authority as long as they submitted to Inca rule. Now, the conquered societies paid tribute mostly in the form of labor. Now, this labor came in the form of what is known as a mita. Now, the word mita in Quechua essentially refers to the same concept that we were talking about earlier. If you remember our previous conversation about corvée labor, remember, corvée labor is basically tax. It's a form of taxation that you pay with labor. So instead of people paying in money or in goods, peasants would often be told to pay your taxes in the form of labor, whether building roads, canals, bridges, government buildings, et cetera, et cetera. The mita operates the same way, where local peasants were told to essentially give up 3 months of their time in the form of taxation. Now, these peasants were then used to build the massive road networks that you see here. Right? These road networks, again, were an incredible or important part of Incan rule, because they connected the far-flung regions of the empire, and even over severe mountains and places like the Atacama Desert. Remember, the Atacama Desert is the same region that we were talking about earlier, where it basically has not rained in 11,000 years. So again, needless to say, these roads are incredibly important, and they were mostly constructed through the use of this mita. Now, the Incan government would also forcibly transplant large populations of one part of the empire to another. When a new area was conquered, officials would move settlers and discourage them from adopting local customs and culture. So again, the Inca often, if you remember from our previous conversations with the Syrians, used a very effective method of transporting troublesome peoples. In other words, people that were considered rebellious or in danger of rebelling would be moved from one region to another. And again, the purpose of this was to, again, discourage any type of rebellion. Now, the empire itself maintained a tight grip over its territory with an effective communication system. And so again, using the system of roads and the help of, if you remember, quipu, quipu is that knotted strings of rope that were used pretty frequently. Quipu was another method of communication as well. And so This is the thing, is that I will say that by the time the Spanish arrived, both at the Aztec and the Incas, both of these empires seem to have been in some form of decline. In regard to the Aztecs, there is more and more research being done and makes the argument that by the time that the Spanish arrived in 1519, the Aztec Empire was already starting to lose its grip on its empire. Now, keep in mind, both the Mexica and the Incas both carved out their empire through war and would demand an inordinate amount of taxation from its subject peoples. This is always a bad formula, if you look at history in other parts of the world as well. And so you do have evidence that the Aztec Empire was already starting to unravel, kind of in the early beginnings of this by the time the Spanish arrived. Now the Incas, they seem to be more stable, but even then you have a problem. So when the Spanish arrived in 1520, they brought with them illness, needless to say. And one particular illness, smallpox, ravaged the entire population of Mexico. Now, we believe that eventually this illness was eventually brought into the South America, and you have the same thing. In this case, the smallpox epidemic that hit Mexico and arrived in South America actually killed the Sapa Inca. And eventually you have two brothers, right, being unable to kind of agree who will become the next Sapa Inca, go to war with each other. And you have a civil war, and just as the civil war is reaching its boiling point, all of a sudden a group of Spaniards arrive, right, and pretty much take advantage of the situation. And so, again, there is a legitimate argument that can be made that both the Incas and the Mexica both eventually or collapsed or were at the point of their decline by the time the Spanish arrived in 1520 and then eventually in 1530. Any questions?